Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. I'm sure people will still be making their way in, but we're a few minutes after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Shannon Schaff. I'm the Executive Director of the CFA Society of Minnesota, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Investability of Sustainable Agriculture. And if you're wondering if investability is a word, it is not. We made it up, but we're going with it today. Okay, so very special thank you to Bell Bank for hosting us today. We have an in-person crowd, and then we do also have an online crowd. And if you want to participate in the Q&A, we're going to be using Slido. If you're not familiar with Slido, right on your tables is a QR code that you can use, both the online and in-person group. And then you can submit your questions throughout the panel, and then at the end, the panelists will answer some of those questions from the Q&A live. And then I want to just go back here. Oh, I did want to just thank our annual sponsors, the CFA Society of Minnesota. Our territory is Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, so that's why we're here today. And we do have several annual sponsors that help us support us to bring events like this across Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And then it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I will let each of them give a little introduction of themselves. So welcome. Thank you.
So let me start. Thanks, Shannon. I'm Sandro Steinbach. I'm Associate Professor at North Dakota State University, and I'm also the Director for Agriculture Policy and Trade Studies over there. My background is in agriculture economics, and my work focuses on how policy, risk, and markets are intersecting in agriculture. I grew up around farming, and over time I've become more interested in how decisions made in DC ripple all the way down to places such as North Dakota. Being based here in North Dakota at North Dakota State University, I see firsthand how regional innovation and investment are shaping the future of ag. We have a great panel today with us. Ben, Lynn, and Bryce, please introduce yourself.
Cool. Ben Gordon, Hillsborough native, though somehow live in San Francisco now. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fractal Agriculture, and we are a farmland investor who partners with farmers to give them growth capital for their operations.
Yeah, my name is Bryce Wilberding. I'm a Minnesota native. I'm with Lewis and Clark AgriFood. We're a venture capital and growth equity fund based in St. Louis, Missouri, investing across the food and ag value chain, covering just about everything except farmland or branded consumer products.
Hi, my name is Lynn Paulson. I'm the Senior Vice President of Agribusiness Development here at Bell. I've been in the ag banking space for 43 years. I actually started with the Farm Credit System in the early 80s, and that was an interesting experience. And then I left to start a new bank, which is now Choice Financial Bank, and I started that. And about 13 years ago, I came to Bell, and I kind of head up their ag department as well as work extensively in their correspondent bank division. So we do a lot of bank-to-bank business across the Midwest. I deal with several dozen ag banks in various Midwest states, so we get a kind of a bigger picture view of what's going on. I also have a farm back in central North Dakota, so I'm an ag production guy, I'm a landowner and so forth, so I'm probably the voice of the farmer up here, at least from the production side. So.
Thank you, everyone. Let's start by framing the big picture. Why agriculture, and sustainable agriculture in particular, is attracting serious attention from investors. We will talk about what changes in the markets, who's putting money to work, and how value is being created. We will also take a closer look at what makes the Midwest a special place to invest right now. And just as important, what do investors still tend to get wrong about this space? Our first question, why is agriculture a compelling investment opportunity generally?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think when we're out fundraising and we're talking to allocators, I think it starts with, where does it fit in the portfolio and what's going on in the world. And I think, or at least our belief and what we see is that the next 20 to 30 years is going to look a heck of a lot different than the last 20 or 30 years. And things that are real, things that are scarce, they're going to have more value. And agriculture has specifically American agriculture has an immense amount of tailwinds behind it. If you think about that, especially in the long term, you worry about national debt, you care about climate change, you care about inflation, all of those things. It is a unique hedge to that. And it is something that is just very real and important to society that cuts across a lot of political divides. And so if you think about those characteristics, there's a lot of different ways to get exposure to it. And you have that wonderful thing called supply and demand, and we have physics and reality that bound us, and that allows you to kind of wrap your arm around cash flows, risk, collateral in a way that I think not other asset classes maybe are following as neatly in today's world.
Yeah, and I'll add that on the venture and growth side, we look at agriculture as, we're kind of at this unique inflection point post World War II, post Green Revolution, where we're in this fourth revolution of agriculture, where precision, nutrient use, sustainability, nutrient density are all coming to the forefront of how we think about the environment for agriculture. It continues to be a resilient and critical industry. Can't deny the fact that everyone has to eat. Everyone knows that, I just have to say it. So that's why we're excited.
Yeah, when you take a look at investing in sustainable agriculture or land, you first got to take a look at the demographics of land ownership, right? And, given that the average age of the farmer now is just about at 60 years old, there is going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of this farmland in the next 20 years, right? Iowa has some really great statistics. For example, 60% of the land is owned by people 65 or older, 33% is by 75 or older. Only 68% of the farmers have farming heirs, right? So that land is probably going to change hands in some regard, and who's going to buy it. Right now, the primary buyers by far are active farmers, right? I mean, especially the older farmers. You've got, baby boomers like me that go back and buy land at home, whatever, because I got a sentimental attachment to it, whatever, right? So when you take a look at that and who's going to be the next owner, but still given the fact that only 1.5% of the land changes hands annually, is that going to accelerate? Maybe, maybe not, whatever. But at the end of the day, there's still got to be a profit motive in this for whoever is farming the land. But there is concern in the banking world about the consolidation and who's actually going to own the land, right? I mean, if we're going to become a bunch of serfs and just, being a bunch of tenants and that type of thing. And I think you're finding some states already putting some hard stops in there about who owns the land and what type of entities to try to create that still family farm. I always get a kick out of how do you define a family farm, right? I've got 30,000 acre farmers that are family farms, right? So, but I think those are the realities of it, and it's going to be really interesting to see how some of this gets driven in the next decade or two.
Let's talk a bit more about value creation. How does sustainability come into play in terms of value creation and investment opportunities in ag?
Yeah, I think it's truly across the value chain. When I reference the fourth industrial revolution in agriculture, you see it everywhere from upstream in genetics, small molecules, metabolite development, through on-farm efficiency, precision, labor, and then midstream to more efficient processes. I mean, all of those inherently are more sustainable. And then on the consumer side, we're seeing this pull from consumers and corporates for, people care about where their food comes, how it's produced, and we're seeing that push both up the value chain from the end and down the value chain from the R&D side.
Well, yeah, I think, when we take a look at, talk about the value chain, there's still the economics come into play, and, we finance some organic farmers, right? And a couple of years ago, they were knocking it out of the park. That's really retracted in the last couple of years, right? Because price does at some point get to be a factor in the consumer. So I think when you talk about the value chain, you got to think about it. Production farmers are very good about taking care of the land, whatever, right? I mean, I would tell you that in my own, next to my kids, I mean, the land is the most valuable asset that I have, right? And I'm concerned about how it's being farmed. We see more and more of no-till, minimum till, whatever, building organic matter, sustaining that over time. But farmers are slow to adopt and quick to adapt, right? I mean, it takes them a while, but once they pull the trigger, they adapt pretty quickly. But there's still got to be a profit motive in there. And one of the farmers' biggest strengths is their biggest weakness, and that's their independence, right? I mean, don't tell me what to do, whatever. You almost got to make them think it's their idea a little bit. But I think that's changing a little bit with the next generation, right? The next generation is a little bit more open-minded about those types of things, as long as there's a profit motive. But, like Bryce said, when you take a look at how farming has evolved in the last decade or two with precision and genetics and, other than rainfall and heat units, you can just about manage around everything else, right? I mean, you really can. So, what you do with that land and how the crops is produced is going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about agriculture, if you compare it to other sustainable asset classes, often it's driven by regulatory pressures or consumer pressures. And I'm not saying those two things aren't real. I'm saying I don't like those. Like, I don't like investing in that because I think consumers are fickle and I just don't get a lot of joy. The thing that I love is that good agronomy, growing crops well over the long term, and farmers who think about the long term because they have to when they have aligned incentives, it is generally a positive ROI decision to be the same things that are more sustainable that drive those cash flows. When the question is, why the heck doesn't it exist everywhere? And it's because of the risk that a farmer takes. And that's one of those things that, from an investment standpoint, we know how to handle risk. There's all sorts of risk products that are out there that haven't quite made their way all the way to agriculture, whether it's in lending, insurance, or in some cases equity financing and how you go through. And that, to me, is where there's an opportunity where it's, yes, there's these positive externalities, but it's just cash flows. And I don't have to rely on the government. I don't have to rely on consumers and all these and things that a lot of other sustainable asset classes have. And as somebody who's conservative North Dakotan in terms of how you're raised about finances, that's a pretty appealing thing.
Good answers. You mentioned the generational shift while in farm ownership. Could we expand a bit more on what makes agriculture, particularly sustainable agriculture, investable right now, and what has shifted and makes it such a great opportunity?
Well, again, like I said, I think the younger generation probably is. I used to have an old farmer that said, the old farmers are there's a difference between smart and wise, right? I mean, and so when you can combine those two attributes, the wisdom of the older generation with the technological understanding of everything else that the younger generation, that's a powerful combination, right? To do that. I think about the economics and especially in row crops and grain crops, we've had some pretty good years up until the last couple, right? And especially this last year. And, I jokingly say up until last year, a lot of younger farmers, they've never had a bad day. They're about to be tested, though, right now, right? And so we'll see how they handle this. We'll see how it handles and how it plays into some of these. When you talk about sustainability, whatever, I mean, at least in my mind, you're making a long-term commitment, right? I mean, I just was out in Bismarck and I teach at an ag banking school, and the title of my presentation is "A Time to Call an Audible," right? I mean, do you get up the line of scrimmage and, can you pivot a little bit, right? That maybe flies in the face a little bit of sustainability, although they can be in unison, whatever. But, like I said, at the end of the day, there still has to be a profit motive in there. And can you do that short and long term? Because, it's, over the course of 40 years, we've always gone through cycles, right? But these cycles, in my opinion, have become compressed, and the peaks are a lot higher and the valleys a lot lower. So how do you, and it's, one of the questions I get asked a lot of times is what is one of the hallmark successes for farmers? And some will say is how you handle adversity. And I would say quite the opposite, is how you handle prosperity, right? What did you do with the money in years that you made it? Mm-hmm. And to bank, to fill those troughs that allow you to take some of these sustainability practices under control. So.
Yeah, I would echo Ben's point that it's largely about cash, right? And for the most part, the innovation we're seeing on farm and across agriculture that is sustainable is also sometimes in the near term, but generally in the long term, cash positive. Anything, I mean, to the point where, I mean, if you're reducing your nitrogen runoff, positive, generally you're also saving costs on that nitrogen input. So we see that across the industry. It's to the point where when Lewis and Clark thinks about sustainability in agriculture, it's first and foremost about input efficiency. It's about cost savings. And I mean, it's about doing more with less. And it's not about doing more with more as we have been, but I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, if I think about, like, my guess is CFA Society, folks in the room, combination allocators and investors, and so like if I like really dumb down the opportunity, if you have a long enough time horizon, do you want to have something that is inherently supply limited with growing demand, even with demographic trends kind of moving down? I really like that. I joke that like row crop invest. I have friends who do permanent crop investing. It's crazy cycles. It's kind of like commercial real estate. You got to be really smart to do that. I really like investing in an asset that is globally limited in the supply by the biogeochemistry of the soil and weather. And I also really like, despite the fact that we're going to get our butts handed to us by Brazil for the next 2 to 3 years, just given trade where that's moving, I really like the fact that we are in glaciated soils that are advantaged by climate change relative to our big commodity competitors. I don't like the impact that's going to have on society globally as somebody who was in an armed conflict in the Middle East that was partially driven by crop failures and drought in the Levant. So like, I don't like that. But from a fiduciary perspective and thinking about the investment opportunity and how to help mitigate that, both globally for humanity, but especially for our national defense, and where does that go? Like strong, resilient soils, it's a hell of a scarce resource. Like that is a heck of an investment opportunity for folks. And if you, as part of that, can help to enable that by partnering with the people who are best positioned to manage that ground in terms of farmers, like there's a lot of opportunity, whether it's technology, lending, or other opportunities.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about farmland versus commercial real estate, right? There'll never be an acre of ground unfarmed. There's always a tenant, right? You may not always have that in commercial real estate, but I've yet to see an acre of farm ground go unfarmed. At some point, there's somebody that's stepped in and willing to pay some rent, right? So from that standpoint, it really is a good long-term investment.
So let's expand on the opportunity a bit more. What do you see as the greatest return potential in this space? Where is the greatest opportunity in sustainable ag right now?
You have the widest investment mandate. I'm going to you.
Yeah, I think it's upstream. It is genetics. It is the R&D from genetics down to the small molecules. I think that's where we're going to see the biggest step change innovation across agriculture. On farm, it's labor, and then also I guess I would consider this on farm waste stream, new crop, and byproduct valorization. We're seeing a lot of new use cases for both crops and waste streams that haven't been tenable in the past, being now economically viable for high value products. Into a multitude of industries, like including beauty, right? And then further downstream, we're seeing a lot of post-processing and processing technologies that pull more value out of the products that we're seeing today, out of the crops we're seeing today. And so, I mean, we continue to see opportunities across the value chain. I mean, that's why we invest, from farmland to consumer products. That's the entire value chain there. And so it's tough to boil it down. Like Ben said, it's a wide investment mandate, but that's why we like it.
I still think because it's such a distributed industry, like if we went from, I don't know, you have a much better perspective, but I think 2000s to 2015 was the family farm that became a small business, and it was running it as a business versus a lifestyle. I think from then to 2030, 2035, we will see farms become the equivalent of lower middle market manufacturing in terms of the capabilities they have to have. And the difference we're already seeing from profitability and effectiveness from a great local farmer who is progressive, thinking about their everything in their operation and trying to improve and be hungry, and like that cream of the crop of rural America, like they are killing it in a really powerful way. And if whether it's technology and capital to empower them, like that's where I see the biggest opportunity, because it's really an aggregation of underlying tech and just growth in our economy. And there is a lot of low-hanging fruit that is out there, especially where rural America has been underinvested in for a while. And so there's a lot of opportunity that I think will be realized by those people and then those that support them.
I think one of the challenges with the value added is scale, right? I mean, there's a lot of great initiatives out there, but it's a math problem. Can you get the scale on some of this stuff? And and that's why I would assert that in some of these areas, government support to get the scale is probably needed, whether it's probably sustainable aviation fuel or some other whatever type of thing to do that. How do you get it to scale? Because that's at the end of the day, you come back to that profit making money.
What is the role of public-private capital in de-risking early-stage adoption of sustainable efforts in agriculture?
I mean, I think there's plenty of great philanthropic and concessionary opportunities out there. I think at the end of the day, if we're going to say some of these things like regenerative agriculture, or we call it agronomy, conservation, whatever label you want to put on it, like if we're saying that's a win-win between the environment and profitability, like private capital, we should be ready to step up. And there's a pretty robust amount of data out there that shows it at a portfolio level, much less so at that farm level. And so, I mean, I think honestly, I get a little frustrated when I see reports, and like I'm an ex-Bain consultant, there's a big Bain report on it, there's a McKinsey one, there's BCG, there's World Economic Forum, we got enough reports, enough data, like who's gonna build a business model that's gonna help share some of that risk and say, is this thing real or not? And are we actually gonna go do business in the space, or is this all a lot of hot air? And like, I like seeing good fundamental tests of that. And I think great farmers are usually, the cream of the crop of figuring things out right away and how they can adapt. And that sounds like a pretty darn good role for flexible private capital that's looking to get a return versus, it all kind of being spoon-fed by the government.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the challenge is patience of that capital. These development cycles, whether it's a transition to regenerative or the implementation of a new technology or seed variety, you name it, you get one chance a year. If you're working in Brazil too, maybe you bump that to 3 chances a year. So the development cycle for new technologies, for transitions to regenerative, you name it, can be slow. So it maybe takes a different form of private capital that has patience affiliated with it.
And I'm not in the space that you guys are in, but it seems like patience and private capital is an oxymoron, right? It just seems like, that type of thing. Maybe from a little different perspective, sometimes people ask me what scares you most about production agriculture right now, and I say the global south, right? I mean, in terms of what you see in Brazil and in Argentina, and like Bryce said, Brazil is triple cropping some of their stuff right now. And, they added an equivalent to Iowa every 4.1 years. They've got, 100 to 200 million acres you have to bring into production. All they need is economic incentive to do that, right? So that really behooves us up here, whatever. So how do we create value up here for the products that we produce and do it more domestically? Because, we're getting our butts kicked in the international domestic market and, currency and those types of things. So, we've always been really, really good at producing bulk raw products, right? Number 2 corn, yellow soybeans, whatever, without any value added, right? I mean, maybe they go into cattle feed and then things like that, but for the most part, we don't do a lot with it, and the potential is there to do more.
Well, let's bring this back to the farm. Sustainable has to work for producers, both financially and operationally, but also over time. We will talk about what's actually happening on the ground and what's getting in the way and how capital can be part of the solution. And what is the role of the generational shift here, which is key for the conversation. How can investors be good partners to farmers?
Well, I would say from a landowner standpoint, investor to actually understand what goes on in the farm, right? I mean, there's such a misconception about what goes on in the farm, and you still got a little bit of a Norman Rockwell type of thing that, so to really understand that, as they mentioned, farming is a small business, and in some cases it's big business, right? So for them to be a little bit in lockstep about what the goal is, what the land means, and having, the land that my wife and I own, I don't take the highest dollar out there, right? I take the renter that I know is going to take good care of the land, has good agronomic practices, sends me semi-annual updates on everything he does with that land, from pesticides to fertilizer to crops and organic matter. I mean, I feel like I'm part of the operation, right? And I think that's what institutional investors probably need to consider to be a legitimate and bona fide partner in an operation.
Yeah, my short answer is to listen. You see it enough. It's easy for investors to sit outside of the farm and think they know what's best for the farm and the farmer. But I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know more about agronomy than anyone in this room. So like my job is to listen to that and allocate capital accordingly.
I think we're agreeing so much, so I'm going to try to like find a little
right,
element
let's
of
do it,
disagreement.
yeah.
Otherwise, we're all going to fall asleep. Yes, you have to listen, you have to go. My favorite thing is I'm in New York on a fundraising trip, and somebody's just watched Kiss the Ground, and they say, well, what about cover crops? And I'm like, yeah, so like where I grew up in North Dakota, we should use cover crops, right? If you're talking to Dr. Wick, who was here at NDSU, and she has a lot of folks that have done that. Then I go to where the family homestead is up by Stanley. And I'm like, should we use cover crops? They're like, yeah. I'm like, yeah, we get what, like 17 inches of moisture a year and are in a pulse crop rotation system? Like, we don't know that, not to mention the Red River Valley, where, a mile apart on the beach of what was this great big glacial lake, you farm completely differently in prairie pothole versus, that. Like, there's that localization. So yeah, I would say it's less about, I guess, my ask to investors, when there's folks that really understand rural America and really understand farmers and want to go through, I love when that happens. But like, just go to the same thing you do if you were selecting a manager. Like, what are the incentives down to the transaction level, and like, who's the best active manager in that ground? It's going to be the farmer. Just make sure that you have a way to pick out who a darn good one is. Make sure there's transparency in reporting and your expectations and where it goes, and just be clear on what you're trying to get out of it, and make sure it's a win-win. Because I think there are a lot of the farms that we work with, they're not asking for a handout. They're not asking for anything other than just a fair shake to go make you and the other person some money. And if you happen to care about rural communities and supporting that, like, that's pretty darn cool too.
Let's talk a bit about the barriers and challenges you're seeing for farmers and agribusiness generally, and for adopting sustainability and climate resilient practices, and more specifically, what are the opportunities in that space, particularly in the upper Midwest?
I think the biggest struggle that I've seen from an investor perspective is there's a lack of understanding about what the opportunity size in the space is, because we have many of us who have gotten our training in whatever finance, like we have lived in, we didn't go through the equivalent of the 1980s farm crisis across assets. We've lived in a low interest rate world where everything was up and to the right, and a lot of like thinking about where the asset fits is different, because like there are not a lot of seeding platforms for diversifiers that might have an edge over other folks. And so there's a lot of underlying, I don't want to say education, because you don't want to be like preachy on that, and you have to earn your right if you are operating in that space. But being able to frame actually like, okay, where do we sit within the landscape of broader capital markets? So that way, if you do have solutions bottom up from a farm, a processor, or a local community, you can find that matching. And like, that is a tough process in well-trodden industries, and it becomes that much harder in kind of breaking new ground, even though this is one of the oldest sectors and asset classes we have. And so those folks that can kind of move early, like, there's probably an extra edge there.
Yeah, I think it's still, come back to opportunities to purchase land, right? And I'm a big one on statistics. Again, in Iowa, 85% of the land is owned free and clear. There's no debt against it, right? I mean, it sits in pretty tight hands. They can sit and wait, whatever. They don't necessarily, there's not necessarily an incentive for them to sell in a down market or those types of things. And, and typically on a farmer's balance sheet, 80% of their assets and 80% of their equity is farmland, right? Real estate. That's where the money is. And and when farmers are going out of business, it's not because they're broke, it's because they run out of cash, just like any other business, like working capital, right? They can't meet their day-to-day obligations, and they get to a point where they're leveraged up and they can't, but they're not broke, right? So typically, we try to veer them off quite a ways ahead of that, right? And give them some counseling and say, you got a $5, $6, $7, $8 million balance sheet, whatever. There's people, 98% of the people work all their life and don't have that kind of equity. Why would you continue to, put that at risk when you could, even if it's a, 2 or 3% cap rate return, whatever, right? It's still, it's still a recurring income. So.
Yeah, when I think about the main challenges today, for us, we think a lot about on-farm income being challenged, and where we see opportunity there is not so much in, yes, in the yield improvements, but more so in cost reductions. Where is the immediate ROI for producers today? With incomes challenged, we see the balance sheets of the ag majors all being challenged. And so for us, how we think about the entire value chain being impacted negatively and where to find those cost reductions, whether it's in R&D for the majors or in inputs for the producers.
Then you raised a good point about access to capital, right, which can be a very limiting factor for any business. What are the different opportunities for farmers and agribusiness in particular to access capital, and how they can actually diversify the sources of funding available to them?
One of the things that we were talking about earlier in the traditional banking world, one of the concerns that we have is a growing private credit market, right? I mean, and those types of things out there. There's, it better than I do, but there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that are looking for a return and willing to do it at, even if it's higher rates, at better terms, higher loan to values, those type of things. So I think there's always access to capital beyond the traditional banks. But when you go on beyond traditional banks, I think the risk factor goes up, whatever, and you just simply you need to know what that risk is. And then from a banking standpoint, we counsel is that risk worth taking, whatever. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I'm gonna rile Ben up a bit and say that there are opportunities to diversify on-farm income through carbon credits. I think our view on carbon is largely that it's uncertain and that it should never be a primary reason to underwrite any investment. But I'm just setting you up is what I am.
I used to run one of the largest carbon programs with a agribusiness company called Corteva, and thankfully there's a lot of connections to North Dakota because obviously North Dakota is very much on the front foot in a lot of different ways in that space. Bryce, you're right. It's an important option value. Like if you think, I guess I think about the world in scenarios. So like if there is a decarbonization scenario where politically in action it moves that way, it's a hell of a hedge to have a whole nother value stream that's sitting there, even if commodity ethanol, that kind of comes away. Is it going to rival it? Who knows on where does that sit? But yeah, I mean, like at the end of the day, like we have an asset that's incredibly stable, and find me another asset that has roughly 72% of its revenue guaranteed by the U.S. government, and half of that crop insurance subsidy is paid for by the U.S. government. Like that is a really strong floor, not to mention low leverage, low transaction value in the market. So you have this really, really stable piece here, and then you have commodity exposure, which is a really nice add. And you have all this technology that's coming into it. Like that's pretty attractive. I think one of the big trends that not many folks talk about is that rental margins for farmers are declining. And so the value of owning your own assets is becoming even more important as capital intensity is increasing. So that need for capital is there. And so where, obviously I'm talking my own book because we are an equity capital provider for farmers. Like we built a whole product around that need and where it fits, but it's not for everyone. And like when we think like we need to be aligned with that farm's banker, because I don't want to piss that banker off who is so important to that farm's operation as an advisor and as a capital provider. And so I think one of the unique things about agriculture is you got to spend that extra year or two. Your point about patience is an interesting one because I don't love saying that I want people to be more patient for me, because it's like I'm asking for more and that's a kind of a bad investment case. It's more, we're going to be a little slower to grow, but our net retention, because farm sales are sticky. You earn it, you will keep it. And so that business over the future cash flows discounted to current world, like over that 10 years, we think there's a hell of an investment case there. It's just sometimes the how is a little different. And if it sounds a little rambly, it's because like there's a lot of unique things, but it does come down to pretty simple stuff at the end of the day. And like hopefully our farms who are best positioned to manage those assets get to own a decent amount, and it'll probably take some new solutions. We'll get our butts kicked, so will everyone else on that. And it takes collaborating with folks who've been around the block and who have been serving those farmers for a really long time.
I think the interesting thing is, over the years that my opinion is that the ultimate beneficiary of a strong farm economy is always the landlord, right? It's a landowner. I mean, whether it be, government payments, crop insurance, whatever, all the government payments that going out, you know where a lot of those ended up? Right in my pocket, because higher rents, right? So the ultimate beneficiary of a strong farm economy, I think. I got a question for these guys. I mean, I deal with directly and indirectly with hundreds of farm producers. Not one of them do I think understands carbon credits. Not one of them do I know that are getting payments on. Could explain that to me how that works.
I mean, that's the challenge, right? It's this incredibly complex and segmented value chain where everyone through that value chain is taking a piece. You worked more closely with carbon credits, but I mean, it's a nice story, and it can diversify your revenue streams, but it is a challenge. Yeah.
Right, I mean, right now, 10 to 20 bucks an acre for a premium program, if you just happen to fall in that niche. And the real problem with it is let's say you are a central North Dakotan farmer who, followed Dr. Beck and, was early into no-till, you were excluded from the market.
Yeah.
And so, that's the tough thing, where, really important rules to prevent greenwashing and a bunch of BS there don't always fit into the annual production cycle and complexity of agriculture. And sometimes, you have to throw your hand up and say, this isn't for everything. Find the niches where it's a fit, and just recognize that, you're either going to play in that gray area to help bring in some revenue where you can and build option value for the future, or you just got to walk away because it's tough.
Yeah.
Great. Let's talk a bit more about the bottom line, right? There's projections for cash receipts in agriculture are down significantly compared to the last years. Why should farmers and agribusiness care about sustainability from a business perspective? I mean, there's money to be made, right? How can they think about integrating sustainability into their operations?
Well, I would say from a producer standpoint, the benefit is soil health, right? I mean, that is the mother's milk of all of that. And I think the things that you see in sustainability obviously are good for soil health. And so I think that's very much in alignment with what any landowner or farmer would want to see. So,
Yeah, completely agree. What's best for the farm in the long term is generally sustainability. What's going to keep the farm around, what's going to allow you to pass it on to your children or the next generation is taking care of the soil, taking care of your inputs. And I mean, that all aligns. And it's climate resilience too. It's risk reduction or risk mitigation. Yeah.
Nothing to add. Yeah.
Interesting, the spring, especially in the valley here, in the northern valley, it got real dry, right? And last fall was a late fall. And for those of you that understand agriculture a little bit, whatever the good news is, it was a late fall. The bad news is, it was a late fall. Farmers couldn't put away their tillage equipment, and they kept tilling and tilling and tilling until all the dirt was black. A lot of that dirt is in the ditches this spring, right? And it just breaks they'll never get it back. I mean, they'll never get it back in how many lifetimes, whatever. So they tend to get in their own way from time to time and get away from what they do best, because I think they're smarter than Mother Nature a little bit. But I mean, I don't think they'll make that mistake again.
But I mean, we think about why, and it's because the risk management of that one shot a year, if you will get a 1 year pop from tilling the soil, it's going to expose that soil organic matter to air, and you'll have respiration, and a lot of good things happen. It just, you have bad downward cycles. And if you haven't figured that out and no one's helping you share that risk, there's no incentive, it's a J curve. And how many of you in your investing see J curve somewhere else? That's where I think there is a need for basic innovation, and I don't think it's that complex. If you look at the portfolio view, even within the Red River Valley, north to south, just on the edges of the beach and whatnot, and you gave it to everyone and essentially averaged it out, that risk and that return would look a lot more attractive. But for a farmer, that range of outcomes is here. And so, there are bad farmers out there. I'm not here for farmer worship and where that goes, even though I love working for farmers and I love rural America. But, I think there's also pretty good explainers in there. And I think that's where, capital providers and other service providers and just people who want to build in that space, if we can help them with that, that is where the opportunity can lie to maybe align some of those incentives and those challenges.
I think the interesting thing is, in my opinion, the 1980s took out the bad farmers. I mean, the guys that didn't farm well. This next cycle will take out poor managers, whatever, right? I mean, there's a difference. But in the 80s, a lot of people who shouldn't be farming were farming, and they got taken out. And I would say the other thing that's really kind of changed agriculture is not just genetics, but Roundup changed everything. Roundup made good farmers out of bad farmers, right? Whatever. And you know, some of that now over time is weeding itself out too, because you got to do more than just have a good spray program, right? You got to integrate a lot of things. But it's interesting when you take a look how the life cycle of that has morphed over the last couple of decades.
Let's talk a bit more about the generational shift that's upcoming. What is the opportunity, what are the risks, and how is agriculture going to look like in 20 years?
I mean, look at how many, I'm sure folks see stuff across their desks, silver tsunami and generational transition as a big turnover of assets and like making it investable, because like we'll go from that, 1.5% to 2%, depending on wherever Dr. Sherrick ends up every year.
Right.
Right. Like that is probably going to increase. And right now we have 2% institutional ownership in farmland, essentially because it's too fragmented of an asset class for traditional private equity models to work. We would argue there's other ways to invest, but you know, on that, like it's going to make it more attractive, and you'll see that come in. I think what you still have are the local dynamics of, you know, like there is a public auction in Hillsborough that's happening in this area, and that it is a public auction, and it is still very, very hard to go invest in that land, even though, again, it is public, knowing the way that auction is set up and which parcels to bid on and that. And so, like, there's some just conflating things of if you can find a way to get that scale, take advantage of the transaction flow, we probably will see agriculture reach those bigger ends of capital markets, which will just fundamentally change things. And I think many of us hope that we're able to do that in a way that still is supportive of those managers on the ground who just happen to also be family farms.
I think all of real estate is local, right? I mean, it is. And I use the example, and I think maybe Mark has seen that. You know, I put up a chart where it's what they call a plat book, right? And it's got the 36 sections in each township or whatever. And then I've got 4 quarters of land that are in yellow, and in the middle is a blue quarter, right? And it's surrounded by 3 sides of yellow. And I say, if that land in the blue came up, do you think that person in the yellow would be interested in buying? And of course, the answer is yes. And in full disclosure, I'm the guy in yellow, right? I own this land. And if that blue quarter came up for sale, would I overpay? Absolutely. I've been looking at that land for 50 years. I would send my attorney with 5 words, just come home with it, right? I would just absolutely overpay. But that's what drives still a lot of the land market, right? Is, you know, economics doesn't necessarily apply when there's still a lot of emotional driving that land price.
I think there's still a little bit more of the pencils in that, just because of the operational side and like where it goes and that land that's right there. But yeah, there's definitely emotion. All it takes is two buyers, right?
Yeah. So,
And I mean, on the technology side, I mean, I think we all expect a consolidation of farmland. What that means for on-farm technology, specifically high CapEx equipment, is that I think we'll see further adoption of that because of the CapEx required and the economies of scale of the consolidation of farmland. So maybe to Ben's disdain, we do see it as somewhat of a tailwind, but would like to see that farmland retain stay in generational hands.
But I think there's other technologies that will enable. I mean,
Oh,
we got some Grant Farm emerging prairie folks. I mean, look at what happens in North Dakota. I mean, like autonomy is going to drive more consolidation, more competition, but it also means that a family farm can cover more acres. Like that's a pretty weird dynamic where it could go both ways. And so if you look at, you know, folks that are trying to engage that farmer early in that process, which luckily here in Fargo and in North Dakota, like we have really, really cool entities that are doing that and really great companies from all over the country engaging. Like that's where, like if you have that inside track, like those farmers who are engaged, they're going to do better. If you have the investors who are engaged, they're going to understand, and you'll kind of get the best of the old and new, ideally. But, you know, it'll still be whoever wins in the market.
it's kind of interesting a little bit about, you know, what drove size and scale in operations, especially in equipment. It was a shortage of labor, right? I mean, they just didn't have that many people to go out and run 3 tractors when you could have one big one with one operator that knew what he was doing, whatever. So, you know, that lack of skilled labor even at the farm level has driven some of that. And well, in fact, when I go back to the farm, whatever, I mean, I've been, you know, away from the farm for, you know, enough years, whatever. When I go back and my tenant is harvesting, whatever, and he asked, will you get in the quad track and move that grain cart? And I get in there and I see 4 computer screens and I go, nope, I'm not touching anything, right? and I walk out because I'm going to ruin something. So.
All right, let's turn now to the policy arena. An arena that plays a big role in shaping investment decisions in agriculture, especially when it comes to sustainability. Agriculture is heavily influenced by federal programs. Think about risk management tools and conservation policies. But policy also brings uncertainty, which can complicate investment timelines, return, and risk profiles. How does the current policy environment shape how you approach investing in sustainable agriculture? Are there specific programs or signals that guide your thinking?
Well, from my standpoint, from a producer standpoint, again, it's that level of uncertainty, right? I mean, you go from Biden to Trump, and it's just like, it is a little bit of a roller coaster. And you throw in that, HHS Secretary Kennedy and doesn't like pesticides and all that kind of stuff, and throws a whole new dynamic on there. I honestly don't know how you make long-term decisions on such variable. And I know you want to take the long view, right? But are you ready for the roller coaster ride in between? So.
Yeah, the word of the day is uncertainty, absolutely. So what we are looking for is opportunities that are, one, that don't require regulatory tailwinds, and 2, that are generally bipartisan. The Make America Healthy Again movement, that is generally bipartisan. A lot of this push recently, is coming from the current administration, but I think everyone wants to see, the consumer generally wants to see healthier food. They don't want to see, Roundup on their food. Whether they know it or not. We were surprised by how little glyphosate was actually mentioned in the new report, and so I think that sticks around, and farmers need it. But looking for tailwinds that are not tied to regulatory changes, I think that's key, especially, and it's even more so with the uncertainty today.
Can I interject? All this stuff about healthy foods and wanting to know where your food is coming from and safe food, whatever. And with all due respect, consumers are such hypocrites, right? They talk about that, and I drive by, and they're pouring fertilizer on their lawns in town, and they're doing all this kind of stuff, and it's like, where's the consistency here, right? It becomes a little bit of a catchphrase about, processed food, and I get all of that, but I do view a little bit of inconsistency in that, and that's maybe the farmer in me, right? So.
There's inconsistency at the policy level,
sure,
too.
yeah.
It's everywhere. Maybe the 2 buzzwords are inconsistency and uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I'd say North Dakotan, fellow Army veteran, work in agriculture and finance, live in San Francisco, married to an immigrant wife. So you can imagine what my social media feed looks like and the debates on these things that I see amongst close friends. So how do you invest through it? Find the thing that cuts through, and cash flows are pretty cool. On that, what happens if you're worried about the national debt, you're inherently and you believe that climate change is real. Well, what could happen? Well, eventually reinsurance costs and the taxpayer will come and they'll fight each other. So what happens if we lose the crop insurance subsidy? How are you going to invest through that? That's a pretty darn big risk. Well, then look at Australia. Well, all land came down because the safety net came out, and then high quality land came up because supply came down. And so a lot of these things where there are inconsistencies, I guess I believe a lot of it's time frame. And maybe I'm a lazy investor because I like to invest on a long-term thesis and a long-term asset and where that goes, so I don't have to prognosticate on the near term. But I do think, at the end of the day, I have commodity farmers that are looking for consumer opportunities if they come up, but they're not going to rely on them. They're looking for a carbon credit opportunity to come up to diversify, but they're not going to rely on it. They're trying to buy that option value, just like many of us do in our portfolios and how we think about it. These are smart folks, and they're thinking not just the business mindset that many of us have. They're trying to add imagine all your family legacy of 100, 150 years resting on your ability to adapt. That's a pretty big lift, and that's why we think that those folks with those incentives and that level of learning. I do think your manager comment about who's going to get washed out, that's probably one of the best articulations that I'm certainly going to steal that on that, because I think it's true, and I think policy will be one of the biggest drivers of, are you acting through how you want the world to be or how it is? And I think all of us will maybe have to eat some crow on things that we want and see, and I guess that's just kind of life. And I think you just invest through those fundamentals that can, weather all that.
But I believe the private sector has to drive most of this, right? I mean, you can have government support, but that's going to be more limited, going forward. And, obviously on a macroeconomic basis, if you see the projection and interest on the national debt's going to eat up 30% of our revenues by 2035, what does that leave for discretionary spending? Virtually none, right? When you take a look at all the mandatory expenditure, there's nothing left on the vine for that, right? So it's got to be moving towards that being done in the private sector, because I don't think the money just isn't going to be there, right? So.
Let's get a bit more specific on some of the regulatory hurdles that you're facing. How do you navigate regulatory or legislative uncertainty? What's your approach here? When it comes to timelines, incentives, or compliance rules, as they're likely going to shift on a very frequent timeline?
Optionality, and then consistent language. Like we have impact investors, so like anti-ESG push. A person who I've taken a lot of feedback from is a very large Texan institutional investor who was like quoted as saying we're at peak woke like 2.5 years ago. Like there are win-wins, there are things that cut through, and that's one of the cool things about agriculture is like everybody has some embedded interest. And so, I mean, there are risks to being in that gray area, but maintain your optionality and like find whatever is like the basic common denominator. And I think it helps you to manage a lot of that risk if you have the option to. But if you're building a company where you don't, or you have a technology that's reliant, that's still an important bet. Like sometimes you just have to accept it.
I think the producers got to figure out, pick where they want to spend their money, right? Because they're not going to be, it's just not going to be able to be all things to all people, and you're not going to be able to have all these different programs funded, right? So you're going to have to narrow it down, and hopefully as a consistent group, whatever, decide this is where, in my opinion, it should be on sustainable soil health, right? I mean, there should be some incentives to create that, because that's a legacy deal. And some of these other things, and you mentioned crop insurance, and it's like 62% of the average premium is subsidized by the government, and that's part of the cheap food policy, and I get all that, whatever. But is that wherewithal going to continue to be there, and how do you rely on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo a lot of the things we've said already, that, I mean, cash flow is king. ROI on these decisions, regardless of the regulatory effects, that's first and foremost when making an investment decision. And then on the uncertainty piece, I mean, outside of regulatory, there are corporates and there are private incentives for sustainability in agriculture. Just about every CPG company has net zero goals. Granted, many of those are being pushed back from 2030 to 2050. So there is uncertainty in the private markets too, as far as what the tailwinds or headwinds are, especially when it comes to sustainability. So finding opportunities in spite of that is the most important.
It's interesting, we've been concentrating up here talking about row crops and grain crops and all those type of things, and we haven't talked about the livestock industry, right? And that's obviously huge. Even in this area, there's 2 proposed large dairies, right? One down in Abercrombie, down by Wapaton, and one up by Hillsborough. 25,000 cow dairy up there and 12,000, which interestingly enough, if you know North Dakota statistics, if you were to put those 2 dairies, and if they both got up and running, you would quadruple the number of cows milked in North Dakota, right? That's how few cows we milk. But the interesting thing is, I know the operation, right? I know they do a lot of things right from a sustainability standpoint, from manure management. I mean, they do a lot of things really, really well. Disease control, all that type of thing. But massive pushback, right? Not in the NIMBY, not in my backyard, whatever. And so even operations that are pretending, we've got feedlots that do the same thing, that are doing things right, not in my backyard, right? And they'll find reasons to oppose that and to push back on that. And so maybe you've got some other dairies out there that aren't doing it right, and they don't pay the price.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example is we see several companies with novel feed additives for methane reduction.
Yeah.
That's great. But what's even better than that is novel feed additives that improve FCR, and then on top of that, they'll reduce methane. And that's the economic benefit. If I can feed less and grow more,
Yeah.
it's a no-brainer. And then if you have methane reduction on top of that, great.
There's a lot of discussion what the role of government should be in private decision-making, in agriculture more general. What kinds of government support or frameworks help de-risk early-stage adoption of sustainable practices, either for producers or also from an investor perspective?
It's a very loaded question.
Yep.
I don't enjoy policy. I don't enjoy consumer. So what I will say, like the one area that I've consistently looked for a little bit more support is just data harmonization, where the government is already paying for things. And like, okay, what does that mean? Buzzwordy like thing. In other words, like how do we actually price risk? And you're talking about highly variable systems, both spatially and through time. And so you actually need some sort of central data collection, which would then allow us, whether we're talking about a 25-year land note, a 10 to 15-year equity investment, thinking about long-term technologies that can change those curves. And we have a great university system. The USDA has done a lot. A lot of that's being pared back right now. And at the end of the day, like there is a lot of financial risk that is mispriced in climate in general, and we're going to face a lot of that in ag. And so a lot of us are kind of like finger in the wind about where does that hit, just like, home portfolios of mortgage-backed securities in Florida. And I think we could use a little bit of help there.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for us is, again, the timeline to introduce and develop technology with 1-year feedback loops in agriculture. And so there are several resources, I mean, even here in North Dakota, that help companies through that 0 to 1 risk, through the product development, through field trials. And so more ecosystems like this here. I mean, this is what we need. Non-dilutive funding is also very helpful.
I don't have any comments there.
Are there particular public-private efforts, insurance products, or loan products that you have been seen successfully moving capital into the space? What are the success stories?
Grand Farm.
Oh,
The university extension system, and luckily, I don't know if you're technically, I can't remember if you're technically part of that, so I don't want to like just, like there, but like we are like, we rely even as investors on a lot of that public data. While you're talking on Iowa State, Purdue, NDSU, there is so much valuable data that is used by so many different folks. And like those are things where if you look at our history of innovation and development across multiple sectors, but including agriculture, like it has been high ROI for society, capital players, and the underlying communities, which is pretty darn cool.
Yeah, from a lending standpoint, there's some programs out there, the Farm Service Agency and young farmers that incorporate, the private-public partnership that we work with, and, to meet certain benchmarks and that type of thing. I think a lot of those opportunities are probably more on a smaller scale, which is probably okay, right? That's maybe where the dollars should be going. So,
Yeah, I would echo that entirely.
yeah.
I mean, North Dakota's pretty unique with, you got legacy fund, you have all, where a lot of those things are going and where it benefits the state. We see sovereign wealth funds doing similar things, whether you're talking the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund or a lot in the Middle East. And you see the strategic deployment of capital and where that fits. And I think it's pretty cool to see that back home, when everyone's kind of huffing how great they are in California and you see these models there. It's pretty fun.
all right, another loaded question. What role should policy play in enabling longer-term investment into sustainability? Are there untapped opportunities to align policy or public tools with private capital? What's the role of government?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I do think, to Ben's point about sovereign wealth funds, I think you see a lot of investment in other countries in food security and deployment of their national dollars towards that. Would love to see more of it here. I don't want to get too deep into policy, but I mean, it's something we need more of. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, I commented about consumers being hypocrites. Farmers are as well, right? And myself included. I mean, they all say, the government, the farmers are independent and the government stay the heck out of my business until I need you. I've never seen one farmer turn back a check. Just doesn't happen, right? So, so what is the role? That's just a commentary, I guess. So.
All right. Thank you all for the great insights and perspectives. Let's open it up now to the audience and let's get Slido going, basically. Mackenzie, I will hand it over to you now for Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, first, let's give a round of applause to our panelists and moderator. Just as a quick intro, my name is Mackenzie Merrill. I'm on the board of directors of the CFA Society of Minnesota. I focus on sustainability initiatives, and my day job is I am a senior investment analyst at Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, a large private foundation just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And just a reminder, so Slido is still open, so feel free to still submit your questions as we're going through Q&A. We have a lot of questions to get through. And so the first thing I want to say is, Sandro, you are our agricultural policy expert on this panel. And I think we'd be remiss to not ask you about your perspective in terms of what do you think investors should be watching or understanding kind of in the policy landscape right now? We talked a little bit about the dynamics of agriculture in South America and currency and, how the U.S. can compete in this environment. So I think it'd be awesome if we could hear some of your perspectives.
That's a really good question and a loaded one as well. Ben, right, you brought up some good points in the beginning. I mean, there's more competition in global markets, right? There's the question, are we overproducing in agriculture? How much are we producing with the demands that we are facing? Corn yields are going up like that, while at the same time the demand for corn is flattening out over the last year. So how can we bring new products to market, actually, that allow us to add more value, basically, to production agriculture, basically? At the same time, seeing more uncertainty in markets and how that international uncertainty is feeding back into national market is something that is a major concern, and that's something that I think needs to be addressed soon to take out some of that uncertainty and make decision making for farmers an easier task.
Yeah, just to add the comment to that, about I think the average yield on corn is increased by 2 bushels per year for the last 50 years. I mean, the trend line just keeps going up, right? And we can't produce ourselves into profitability anymore, right? I mean, we're growing more and more stuff that we can't get rid of. So how do you maybe hit the reset button and maybe dial that back and think about more value added rather than just pure production, right? Because that, over time, unless something dynamically changes in the world market, that isn't going to work.
I still think climate is massively underpriced and underappreciated because it's been so over-politicized. So a study in Nature that was funded by insurers, and I don't know too many insurers who play, label, like they vote with their checkbook. 50% of Brazilian agriculture will be out of its climate optimal zone by 2030, not 2050. And if you think about your point on big highs and big lows, I mean, non-glaciated soils and the water cycle is driven by a forest that's being deforested, albeit slower now. And so are we going to get our butts kicked for the next 3, 5, however many years? Yeah, probably. But do I feel pretty good about a long-term asset, like with just the biogeophysical realities? I think also that. Can those farms, can businesses weather that storm?
Yeah.
And where will there be opportunities in that?
And then how long this storm is going to last, actually, right? You talked
exactly.
4 or 5 years. I mean, that's a very short one outlook for investing into agriculture, actually. So if you think about sugar production in Texas, for instance, right, had been an industry for 100 years in place, basically. Now with political changes and infrastructure changes, that industry was wiped out in a few years, basically, where basically once the infrastructure, the supply chain is going away, the farmer has no more access to sell its product, basically, and once the value added is gone, the agriculture is gone, basically, and that's a challenge, I think, that we have to face here if we are going through cash receipt projections that are getting worse every year, basically, over the next couple of years.
Great. Well, Diving more into our Q&A, I think you guys all did a very great job of making the case for the investability of sustainable agriculture, because I have a lot of questions about how does one invest in this space. So the first question, direct investment in farmland and agriculture seem difficult to source. How can retail and institutional investors access this asset class? I feel like this is a good tee up for Bryce and Ben.
I think that's more Ben.
Public setting, SEC rules, all that fun.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like there are some long-term investors that have been out there. I think if you really think about it, like what are you trying to invest in? There's great, especially being in the Midwest. There's a lot of great brokerages that offer a lot of services out there, and getting that exposure. It really comes down to like what are your portfolio goals, just like anywhere else. What is the liquidity? What are you trying to get? How much active management do you want to have? And do you actually believe some people's thesis that farmers are best positioned and like where that fits? And I think there are some good legacy options, but really it is not a very investable place yet because there's not a liquidity. There's some California pensions that tried to put several $100 million checks in, and they couldn't find anyone to actually deploy it. And so we think that's an opportunity, and especially where there's local connections and you have that, probably means that you got a leg up.
Then we find that the venture and growth strategy in food and agriculture is generally correlated with the real assets, as opposed to venture and growth equity in other markets. So that's where we see a lot of the resilience and opportunity here as well.
That is a great lead-in to this question for Ben and Bryce. How do you see investments in your funds fitting into a broader diversified investment portfolio? Are they return enhancers, diversifiers, or other?
I'm not sure how to walk this line of promoting the fund, but also just speaking to our investments. But I think there's opportunity for venture and growth in food and agriculture, both in resilience. It is like I said, similar in risk reduction and correlation to the real assets, but also has the potential for very real venture type upside. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
I'd say we're a hedge that pays a coupon. It's if you are worried about those tail risk scenarios and common fiscal risks, inflation, state of currency, or just the resilience and macroeconomic, like there's a defensive element. But the thing about that commodity exposure with that safety net that we find really compelling is that you're playing offense when the rest of your portfolio is getting hammered. And so oftentimes we'll say, you don't want us to hit the top end of our return because that means everything else that the other part of your barbell and that portfolio is probably not doing as well. But having this is a really big add, and call me old school, but I like overall sharp ratios, diversification, like cash flows, and farmland tends to fit really well on that, especially if you think climate change is real.
This is a little bit outside my space, but I think it's a little bit important how the institutional investor positions themselves within the area, right? I mean, I can think of a couple of situations, not in North Dakota, like in Illinois, Iowa, and so forth, where institutional investors have come out and bought big blocks of land, right? And they came in and they bought, and they really ticked off local producers, right? I mean, so farmers that are selling, they can talk about wanting local, but at the end of the day, it's all about who's got the high bid, right? So the one situation I'm talking about, and the investor just turned around and said, look, I just made y'all a bunch of money because your value of your land on your balance sheet just went up, right? So, but I think, to make that a more palatable, reputational type of thing, I think they could take a few lessons on how to position themselves within the farm community.
Which I think many of us would argue is better management of the asset itself.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think this is probably a good question for Lynn. On the lending side, what is the industry doing to help young farmers manage those tough years?
Boy, that's a great question. First of all, that's one of the questions that I get asked probably more often than not. How does a young producer get started? It is very, very difficult, right? Just access to land, the capital required for machinery and equipment, all of that type of thing. Unless you're born into it, it is very difficult, but it can be done, right? I mean, how to eat an elephant, one bite at a time, right? So you start small, you got an off-farm income gig, you do some things, you partner up, you find value-added farmers markets, sustainable beef, whatever type of thing. We see people out there that maybe gross less than $500,000 a year that earn a really, really good living and earn more money than producers that are grossing $3 million, right? Bigger isn't always better. So I think it can be done, but you got to slow walk it, but it certainly can be done. But you got to have a plan, right? I mean, you got to have a plan. You got to know your numbers. The biggest path to failure is not knowing your numbers, right? So.
And be ready to do paperwork for all those programs.
Exactly. Yep.
You guys touched on this topic, so now pivoting kind of that younger farmer and more mature, experienced farmer divide. You talked a little bit about the technology and the adoption of technology and what that's going to look like going forward. And one of the questions from our audience members, they're from a livestock monitor sensor startup. They said they're having a lot of success with adoption from younger producers, but are having more difficulty reaching kind of older producers and that demographic. So, what are your thoughts on some of this, because these technological advances, a lot of them, tying it back to sustainability, can increase productivity, sustainability, a lot of other things that are positive for farmers. So how should we be thinking about adoption kind of across the generations of farmers in that approach?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's kind of interesting, how do you define a young farmer, right? I mean, when the average age of the farm producer is 60 years old, in my opinion, a 45-year-old farmer is a young farmer now, right? I mean, so it is a little bit of that type of thing. But I think it goes back again to, that adoption of the technology, being open-minded, but being able to be able to pencil out why this makes sense, right? And both from a P&L standpoint and even from a sustainability standpoint. I think maybe some of the younger producers understand and appreciate some of the sustainability more than the older farmers. It's not that the older farmer doesn't care, but it's always been part of his DNA, right? It's always been part of that. So I think that if you're going to move the needle in this area, it is going to be with the younger producer.
Yeah, and then on top of a clear value proposition, I think it's got to be the most frictionless sales motion you can make it. No one wants to change their practices. And so however you can implement new technology by changing the least, whether it's asking someone to make additional passes on their field. I mean, that's a huge friction point. So ultimately, clear value proposition and reduce as much friction as possible.
And clear communication, and that's the other piece. That's where the land grant system comes in. Actually, the extension mission of NDSU, for instance, is a prime example how we can reach difficult to reach communities in agriculture. As I said, also ecosystems play a big role. You mentioned earlier grant farms and all the good things that they have brought to the region, actually. And that's another opportunity, right? Demonstrate, show, and learn. And once I hear that my neighbor adapted, well, maybe I should consider that too. So this kind of networking component, based on how I grew up and where I grew up, that matters a lot, actually.
So when we take a look at marketing to farm producers, we always struggle with, how do you market to those and where are they getting their information, right? Producers my age, we still get it at the local co-op and coffee shop, right? Whatever. Younger producers and whether it be in the social media or if they're following. But that space is so bifurcated. It is so spread out, and we take a look at the numbers, where are they getting their information? How are they getting information? How do we know if it's reliable, right? That type of thing. But I think at the end of the day, I think it's proven techniques, what works, being able to share that, although generally producers are somewhat independent. But I think the younger generation is probably more willing to share that than the older generation, right? I mean, I can remember my dad way back in the day, and I asked him about fertilizing and why he did what he did. And he said, well, that's the way I've always done it, period. And that was the end of story. Whatever, there was no more discussion. That obviously has changed.
Are you in Farm Talk yet, Lynn?
No.
I'm not either. I don't have TikTok, but that is a thing. Like farm talk is a thing. When I was in Afghanistan, I met, and knew I wanted to go back into agriculture. I probably met 50 farms because like that was like the golden age of farm Twitter. And if you only got one learning cycle a year, like the farms of the future, they figure out ways to accelerate that. They actually get really networked, less with their neighbor, more with like other peer farms that aren't directly competitive. And it's really cool to get those learning loops because they teach you a lot of stuff that you had no idea on, even if you think you're the expert.
And that's why there's a lot of good opportunities. You know, we get farm business management in Minnesota and different states that, you know, you get aggregate data, whatever, you know, so you can, you know, you have something to compare to, right? Peer data and you know, and how am I doing? And you say compared to what? Well, there are benchmarks out there to do that, but you have to be willing to get involved and being willing to, you know, have the discipline to do that.
Great. Bryce, I think this one may be a good question for you. What are some good examples of successful sustainability programs from CPGs or biofuel companies?
Yeah, I think we do see just about every CPG company with a clear sustainability mandate. I will highlight the issues first, and that's that procurement teams and sustainability teams are typically siloed. And that can create some pretty clear conflicts within the organizations. But where we see it successful is, I think PepsiCo, despite rolling back one of their mandates recently, I think is relatively successful across the agricultural value chain and in retrofitting some of their fleets with biodiesel. I mean, you look to Cargill working with Regrow. You look to AB InBev working on regenerative agriculture for some of their grain sourcing. I mean, you typically see it across the board. Where we've yet to see it is at a meaningful scale.
There's some around, and General Mills has a big one in the valley with,
I mean, everyone's
with
got
Pepsi,
something, yeah.
with that. I mean, like, I think there's actually been a decent amount in North Dakota because of the amount of food crops that also go in. But I think it's also important for us to remember that less than, 20% of corn and soy goes into food?
No.
So depending on how you want to count exports and where that goes. And so like now that's where biodiesel or biofuels and that come in. And it gets really interesting about like what is the lever that's actually going to move the needle on that.
Yeah, that was my question. So, you know, if there's not meaningful scale, is it a math problem for the companies? Like what's keeping it from scaling?
I think it's the lack of consequences for not hitting those goals, right? These sustainability programs aren't the cheapest things for these companies. In a lot of ways, it's a marketing tool. And as long as it can be a marketing tool, that's enough for the most part. And so I think we all agree consumers are fickle, but that's what's going to drive those CPG decisions, unless there are regulatory changes.
Interestingly, when you mentioned PepsiCo or Pepsi, whatever, you know, I've got a number of potato producers, right? And they grow potatoes for Frito-Lay, which is owned by Pepsi. The amount of documentation that they have to now provide Frito-Lay or Pepsi in terms of everything they do, whatever, from the time that is planted till it actually is pretty cool. And I would say it's made them a little bit better producers even, right? So, but that's food grade stuff. But there's bulk raw commodities. You know, we're not there, and to get there, you got to get those guys in the loop, right? So
it costs a lot of $40 to $50 an acre to do a cover crop in terms of total all in. As of a couple of years ago, might be a little bit more than that. Average program is going to be somewhere between 15 to 20. So you can do the math. Like there needs to be some other benefit that you believe on where that goes. And so if they're struggling to pay up an existing structures and they really need to double the farmer output, it's kind of the math of where people aren't getting there.
generally talk about government programs, and you know, for a long time, CRP was a real good program, right? There was a lot of farmland that should have been farmed that went into CRP, but when commodities got short, all of that came back out, right? And so there's a lot of grassland, pasture land that or CRP that came out, and that's where the roller coaster a little bit there. And if they could make that program viable to keep it in there, I mean, the benefits of it are enormous, just from soil sustainability, wildlife, number of areas that make sense, but it just hasn't been consistent.
I think this one probably came in based on, for this next question, from your comments being a landowner, Lynn. What role do landowners play in terms of implementing sustainable practices?
Kind of like being on a board of directors, nose in, fingers out, right? I mean, it's that type of thing. I mean, I'm not going to tell a guy how to farm, whatever, but I think you can dictate a little bit of the, process. I mean, I've even got a fertility provision in my land contract, right? That if, we take a baseline of fertility and if he leaves or whatever, and there's a deficit, whatever, he pays there. So, and again, I minimum till different types of things on it. I don't tell them how to farm or what to grow, but we are in general agreement on that. But that's a relationship you have with your tenant, right? I mean, but I think that's important.
Just please don't mandate that they have to change a practice that has upfront costs and then pull the land out from them after that period, because the amount of farms that I've dealt with that have had that, and there's a reason that rented ground is an impediment to a lot of the adoption of these practices. So I'm not saying you have to go all the way to sharing, but at least, maybe don't actively inhibit good long-term decisions of these assets in our communities.
But I've done that, but to do that, I've given them a 2 or 3 year contract to do that.
Yep.
Not an annual one, whatever, so you can afford to make those upfront investments to do that.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think we have time for one more question. There's a question around what you all see as the next evolution, for sustainable ag and agribusiness, and then I'm just going to throw in AI in terms of sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, on the AI piece, I mean, it's such a buzzword, but it is a meaningful step change across the agriculture value chain. We're very excited about AI in R&D for genomics down to metabolomics and the progression of new inputs, new seed traits, you name it. I mean, that's all progressing so much faster. And then on farm, precision agriculture. Whether it's labor, whether it's precision weeding, whether it's precision nutrient application, we're finally at a point where we have the data to support those models, and on edge cases, which are the biggest challenge in agriculture. You're not in if you want to do it with true AI, you need to keep the human out of the loop, which is the biggest challenge in ag specifically. But we're getting there. And then on the sustainability side, we finally have, plenty of companies with the measurement, reporting, and verification models, whether it's in-ground or aerial to, measure soil carbon, measure nutrient density, measure water content, you name it. To the point where we can make smart, sustainable decisions that are best for the farm. So very excited about all this.
Yeah, I think from a precision agriculture standpoint, I think the nice thing about that from a producer standpoint is it's in lockstep. It drives costs down, right? It really does. And you take a look at even in the precision of some of these planters, and when they come to an angle at the end of the field, the row unit shut down so you don't double. It's really pretty cool about what they do. From a general producer standpoint with AI, I think we're a long ways. There's just not enough data set yet for that but as more data becomes available, AI becomes more reliable. Maybe more from your standpoint, it's got legs, but from a producer standpoint, we're a little ways out of that.
We do AI office hours with some of our farms. I have farms that are using ChatGPT just as an advisor, just as somebody to run stuff by, just like I do. And we're trying to get those learning cycles repeated. We're not going to make money off it. People know that we care. We win when our farmers win. All of a sudden, they're running better businesses, and to be able to just bounce something back and forth, review a contract with your input company that you never would have reviewed before, and it's great. Not giving legal advice and where that fits. I think I'm very excited about how that technology will make it easier for farms to run more efficient businesses and to not be alone in that very lonely farm CEO seat. Even more, that is probably one of the most exciting things that's happening. I can't really invest in it because I don't think it's particularly investable, except in those operators. The only other weird thing that I think is relevant to the North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota audience is data centers are going to continue to drive up demand for water and for land. And if being in a cold place is a massive advantage, I'm going down to Texas tomorrow, and like that is driving a ton of water usage and where that goes. If you don't think that I want my operators to know exactly how to think about water rights and where that goes for themselves in the future and how they can take advantage of that and trade out, renewable development or data center development to then go drive more acres. Like, I'm not saying I want more land converted, but I'm saying that I want my farmers to be able to take advantage of those trends and to contribute to positive economic development. And so, like, there are second and third order impacts of so many of these things that being in the upper Midwest, climate resilient places, it is not a bad place to be and to invest.
And on that note, all of us being happy to be in the Midwest. Well, let's thank our panelists one more time. Thank you, Ben, Bryce, and Lynn, and our moderator, Sandro. Thank you to Bell Bank for hosting. Thank you for our virtual attendees and everyone here in person. Just a note, there will be a recording sent to you all after the event and a survey as well. We'd love if you could fill that out for us and give us some feedback. And with that, feel free to stay and network and connect. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.